We might as well start. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege this evening to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Hilary Kilpatrick. And I have to thank her for accepting our invitation at a very short notice, giving us a lecture. And I have to thank Dr. Urfali for giving me the privilege of introducing her. I couldn't say no, he's my chairman after all, so I would be punished if I refuse. I'm sure that many of you know Dr. Kilpatrick and know about her work and have read some of her work, but for the benefit of those who are not very familiar with her, I would just say a few notes that she has done a PhD on Arabic language and literature in Oxford. I will not mention the year, I don't have it anyway.
Just as well.
Yeah. And her PhD thesis was on social criticism in the Egyptian novel. After that, she worked for a short while at the BBC Arabic service. And then she taught at several universities, mainly St. Andrews, Nijmegen in the Netherlands, Texas at Austin, Bern, and Zurich. Dr. Kilpatrick is a very versatile scholar. He actually straddles both classical and modern Arabic literature, and very few people venture to go in both fields. Her concentration is actually on adab, and her main contribution was the book which she published in 2003 on Kitab al-Aghani, which has made a major impact on the field, and I understand that it took her several decades to research that book. So that's something. Since then, she has been drawn to the field of the early Ottoman period, and she has published extensively in that domain, especially on Bilad Sham. She has published works on travel literature, poetry, private letters, and so on. And I also know that she has philological and linguistic interests. And the first time I met her was in Bucharest in 1993, I think it was, at a conference organized by Nadia Angelescu on the history of the Arabic linguistic tradition. So she also has a contribution in that field. Without further ado, I just want you to join me in welcoming Dr. Kilpatrick, who will be lecturing this evening about Arabic poetry among Christians in the early Ottoman period. Ahlan wa sahlan biki.
Shukran jazeelan. So, thank you very much for these kind words. Thank you very much also for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to exchange some ideas with you about poetry in this rather unknown period. And I'll be grateful for any comments and criticism and suggestions which you have. Now, the conventional view of Arabic literature in general, and especially poetry, is this okay? You can hear okay? Yeah, good. So the conventional view of Arabic literature in the later Mamluk and early Ottoman period as repetitive and not worth studying is gradually changing. And after all, it's impossible that a literature would remain frozen for 400 years, which is what the Asr al-Inhitat myth assumes. And there are different ways to study this period, to approach it. First of all, one can look at genres. For instance, travel literature. There's a very varied range of travel literature, in fact, with Moroccan ambassadors, Christian clergy, people hoping for jobs, going to Constantinople, pilgrims, and so. I mean, that's already a field in itself. Then there are studies of individual authors. For instance, there's a fairly recent book on Azabidi by Stefan Reichmuth, which is a very extremely valuable study. Then we have books on the literature in specific countries. For instance, it's quite an old book, but it's still extremely useful. Usama Arnoutis, Al-Haraka Al-Adabiyya fi Bilad Sham, Khilal Al-Qarn Al-Thamin Ashar. There are probably similar works on Morocco or Egypt. I don't know if there's anything on Yemen. That would be an area to work on, I should think. And then we have studies of literary systems and networks within the Arabic-speaking world, like Muhsin Musawi's The Medieval Islamic Republic of Letters, Arabic knowledge construction. And then also one can study specific communities, notably those who join the literary scene in this period. And this, by definition, is a kind of innovation. And this is where I see the study of literature by Christians fitting in. Now, while there are scattered references to Christian poets earlier, the Maronite Germanus Farhad and the Melkite Greek Catholic Nicolaas Essayich are the first Christians for several centuries to have produced a substantial diwan in Fusha. Poems by them and by the slightly later poets Ibrahim al-Hakim and Antoun Bitar form the subject of this paper. Germanus Farhad, who lived from 1670 to 1732, belonged to the first generation of Maronites to have been educated entirely in Aleppo. As you probably know, earlier generations, in fact, had their education in Rome, and in fact, very many of them remained there. Now, Farhad, as a young man, moved to Lebanon, and he became a monk in the Lebanese order, and later on became the superior of it, before he returned to Aleppo in 1725 as the archbishop of the Maronite community. And his dictionary and works on grammar and rhetoric are recognized as landmarks. Judgments of his poetry, however, are less unanimous. Maroun Aboud and Louis Sheikho have rather different evaluations of him as having certain faults, poetic license in meter and vocabulary, but on the other hand, he's recognized as having a fine natural disposition and a wide range of themes. Most of his poetry is on religious themes, but there are one or two poems of panegyrics and elegies treating people he knew. All of one of them are friends of his own age or younger. And the exception is Athanasius de Bers, who was Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch. Germanus addressed a madih to him in 1712, while Athanasius was Archbishop of Aleppo and was on a visit to Tripoli. Now, this panegyric modifies the conventions of praise poetry. The introductory section departs from the traditional nasib, which was obviously problematic for monastic poets. But the customary alternative beginning would have been philosophical or ethical reflections related to the later themes of the poem. Germanus, however, as a monastic poet, Germanus starts with recollections of a friend. However, تنبح دهري من عهود معاهدي فأسعدني تذكار تلك المعاهد حللت به في برج سعد كأنني حللت به فوق السحى والفراقد رعى الله أياما حمدت جديدها بتجديدها إحسان تلك المحامد وأذكرني من أنسها ما نسيته وحاشاي أن أنسى ذمام المساعد. And then we have a rihla, a transitional passage, reflecting on the importance of having friends around one, with the passage of time not so much increasing the pain of separation as nourishing the desire to benefit from the virtues of the friend already referred to, who is now the subject of eulogy and thus the patron or mamduh. And here Athanasius is praised first of all as a leader or imam and guide in the path of truth, seated in glory among the sun and stars. With his birthplace, Damascus, his episcopal see, Aleppo, he is linked to important cities of Christianity, past or present. He preserves his flock from enemies, equipping it with the armor of faith and the sword of the gospel, and he bestows favors on every sincere worshipper. In a daring parallel, he is even said to have sanctified any place where he settled as the Lord of Glory, Rabbul Majd, sanctified the promised land. His learning bears fruits wherever he may be, and as a father to his people, he will inherit the kingdom of heaven through his ascetic way of life, with destiny itself recognizing his uniqueness. Now, one could say there's a great deal in that which is fairly familiar in panegyric, but I think this poem departs from the conventions of Arabic poetry in two ways. First of all, it refers to generosity and help, not only in the main section, the Madih proper, but also at the beginning of the poem, with its mention of Ihsan and the unnamed Musarid. And the same person is the focus of the reinterpreted Nasib and the Madih. And this unusual identification is a sort of circular poem.
Louder.
Okay. And this unusual identification can be explained with a look at the relations between Germanus Farhat and Athanasius Dabers. Now, Athanasius Dabers was a generation older than Germanus Farhat. He has attracted scholarly attention mostly because of his tortuous path between acceptance and rejection of the Pope's authority. He was an ambiguous figure. And when Germanus Farhat praises him in this poem composed in 1712 for his firm defense of the true faith and his arming his flock against heretics, he evidently has in mind Germanus's apparent acceptance of the Catholic teachings spread by the missionaries. In fact, Germanus very likely had personal experiences of, or at least he had personal experiences of Athanasius' generosity, and it's, I think, almost certain that in this poem there's a reference to them. When Athanasius returned from Wallachia to establish a printing press in Aleppo, he had already made an Arabic translation of a Greek version of a text by the Moldavian prince Dimitria Cantemir on an ethical and philosophical subjects, which in Arabic is entitled Salah al-Hakim wa Fasad al-Alam Azamim, which I like to translate as the probity of the wise man and the depravity of the reprehensible world. It's got another title in the translation which has been published. Now, Athanasius is known to have enlisted Germanus' help in completing this translation. We don't exactly know what Germanus' contribution was, except that he almost certainly included poetry. There's some poetry in the text, and this is not translated from Romanian, obviously. And he also contributed a preface with a very inflated praise of Athanasius. One can, I think, assume, it's quite reasonable to assume that Athanasius will have given Germanus some reward for his contribution to this particular translation. And a second connection between them is that when Germanus went to Italy and Spain in 1711, Athanasius gave him a list of titles he wanted from Rome, probably with a view to printing them. And again, one can imagine that Athanasius gave him some money to help with the financing of the journey. Whatever Germanus' part in these projects, however, these references to Ihsan and Musarid are, in fact, it seems to me, allusions to a reward. And the reward must have been welcome, because Germanus, who had moved from Aleppo to Lebanon to join a handful of friends engaged in founding a new Maronite monastic order, had left the community in 1700 over disagreements about exactly how the community should be organized. And for 5 years, he supported himself independently, chiefly as a preacher and schoolmaster. He rejoined the community in 1705, presumably shortly after he had cooperated with Athanasius on the Cantemir translation. Now, Germanis could also have included in this poem Athanasius' introduction of the printing press into the Near East in 1705. But he didn't. However, the press, or at least its productions, appear in a poem some decades later. And this was the elegy that the Greek Catholic from Aleppo, Ibrahim al-Hakim, who died, he lived throughout most of the 18th century, and he composed this poem on Abdallah Zahir, who died in 1748, and who was the second major actor in developing printing in Bilad Sham. Now, Ibrahim al-Hakim was from a family of doctors, and I've just seen in a manuscript of his diwan in the library that he wrote one poem complaining about being a doctor because people wouldn't pay you. When they'd got better, they forgot to pay you. Anyway, he was also a poet's secretary who gravitated around governors and local rulers in Syria and Lebanon during the 18th century. And he has many poems addressed to relatives and friends and patrons. He knew Abdallah Zahir, no doubt, through his connections with Aleppo. Abdallah Zahir himself had belonged to Athanasius Dabas's circle in Aleppo after his return from Wallachia and assisted him in establishing the press. And then the two men quarreled when Abdallah, who became a Catholic, engaged in anti-Orthodox polemics, while Athanasius was reaffirming his Orthodox identity. As you know, this period around about 1720, 1724 saw the split in the community of the Patriarchate of Antioch, the Rum, into an Orthodox and a Catholic branch, and this led to a great deal of polemics and controversies. Abdallah sought refuge in Lebanon and established a press at the Melkite monastery of St. John at Shuair in 1731. And this refer by Ibrahim al-Hakim, who belonged to the same community, starts, هل من يرد مواقع الأقدار أو من يكف يد رضا القدار رضا القدار. After this reference to the inevitability of death in general, Ibrahim turns to his specific loss. فقد اعتدى علي الباغي بجوره وعفى بفقدان الوحيد دياري. And then his mourning leads into general praise of Abdallah Zahir as an exceptional being.
وعفى يعني أزال وعفى
عفى به, عفى بك,
يعني أزال.
Yeah. Sorry if I mispronounced it. He addresses the deceased's literary gifts and eloquence and his learning, and then his achievements in printing. And he gives a list of titles that Abdallah published. تبع القلوب على محاسن تبعه كتبا أفادت سامعا ومع قاري فتراه في كتب الأباطيل ابتغى تبطيل مجد العالم الغرار وكذا بميزان زمان أبان عن أبدية الأشرار والأخيار والمرشد الخاطئ ليرشدنا بها وكذلك الجسر البهي الأنوار. Now, if you look at what Abdallah Zahir actually printed, you find these titles, Al-Abatil, Mizan al-Zaman, Murshid al-Khati, are all titles produced in his press at Shuair. And Al-Jisri, and this I didn't know, but Father Joseph Mukarzal pointed it out to me, is the Spanish Jesuit Luis de la Puente, Al-Jisri obviously, the Arabic translation of whose Meditations Abdallah Zahir partly revised. And then subsequently, Ibrahim mentions the subjects of the polemics Abdallahs are engaged in with Orthodox opponents, for instance, on the use of leavened or unleavened bread for the communion, and on the status of the councils of the early church. And then the poem continues with praise of Abdallah's powers of argument and persuasion, moves to the poet's own sense of loss and that of the world at his death, but at the end proclaims that Abdallah's reward in heaven is assured. And, as is common with many of these poems, the elegy concludes with a chronogram of the date of his death. Now, mentioning a deceased scholar's bibliography, especially his polemical writings in an elegy on him, may not be entirely unknown. You may know of these from earlier poetry, but until Abdallah Zahir, the texts would only have been handwritten. The references to printed books and Abdallah Zahir's role in producing them is certainly new. Now, the last example of poems, the last two examples concern elegies on a new martyr, and these two are unprecedented, I think. The poets concerned are Antoun Bitar and Nicolaus Saïr, and they were commemorating Ibrahim ibn Dimitri ad-Dallal, who met his end in 1742. Now, a new martyr is a concept quite familiar in Greece and the Balkans during the Ottoman period, much less common in Syria or Egypt. And it refers to a person who apostatized from Islam, or else who sought to convert Muslims to Christianity, or who insulted Islam. And usually such people were brought before the Qadi, and if they showed no change of heart, they were executed. And the other possibility was to leave the Ottoman Empire, which some of them actually did. Now, the story of Ibrahim ibn Dimitri ad-Dallal is documented. He apparently belonged to a prominent family of Aleppo dragomans and merchants. He was a psychologically unstable young man, and this is an impression from quite a lot of the stories, actually, that these people didn't really know very much what they were up to. Anyway, he came to believe that his family was trying to poison him, and so he went to the Qadi and declared himself a Muslim, presumably to get some kind of protection. Later on, though, and then he discovered that his family rejected him. It was pretty predictable. He spent some time wandering in the city, finally thought better of his decision to convert, and then started to shout, "I'm a Christian." I mean, he was a very confused young man. The bystanders set on him and took hold of him, took him before the Qadi, and despite imprisonment and torture, he stood firm in his faith and was, in the end, beheaded. There was a move to have him canonized, and the correspondence between the Greek Catholic Archbishop of Aleppo, Maximus Hakim, and the Vatican about this has been published. Now, the two poems on his death, of course, they're commemorating the same event, the same person, and are working within the same tradition, but they are not identical. The first I'll talk about is by Antoun Bitar, who was an 18th century poet and khatib in Aleppo, and his diwan exists in a manuscript from Aleppo, but has not been published or studied at all, as far as I know. The only reason that I could talk about him is that there's an extract from his poem in Sheikh's Shu'aran al-Nasraniya Ba'd al-Islam. And this starts off, "Ya sahibi ma balu sukan al-hima kullan arahu walihan yabki dama," which is, and they're so talking to this friend, and then the friend tells the poet the grim news that Ibrahim has died the death of a martyr, and he wonders if the poet is a stranger or absent from Jerusalem not to have known what has happened. It's obviously a reference to the meeting on the road to Emmaus in the Gospel of Luke. He urges him to approach Ibrahim's tomb with reverence, and the poet does so. But then the poet reproaches the mourners because Ibrahim's death is a cause of joy, not sorrow. His blood has given life to Aleppo, and he died not from any fear of hell or desire from the kingdom of heaven, but out of loss for the love of his Lord. And then we have one of these real infuriating remarks by Sheikho, illa an qala, since, he leaves out a whole lot of the poem, and we just don't know how much. So we just then have the 4 concluding lines in which the poet calls down blessings on Ibrahim for enduring insults on earth, but gaining honor among the pure in heaven, and he asks for his intercession on the day of judgment. And the whole is rounded off again with a chronogram. As far as one can judge, this is rhetorically a fairly low-key evocation of Ibrahim's fate, emphasizing his piety and at last asking for his intercession at the day of judgment. But this is entirely hypothetical until we can actually see the whole poem. The second elegy is by Nicolas Saïr, who was he died in 1756. And his name is usually linked with that of Germanus Farahat, but he is considered, I think quite rightly, as a better poet. Like Farhat's, his diwan concentrates mostly on religious themes, but he has more poetry addressed to contemporaries, including Druze, Christian, and Shi'i notables, on whom he composed panegyrics, in order to further the development of the monasteries of his Melkite order. It's rather interesting, in fact. It's a very interesting aspect of his diwan to see how he addresses these various important people that he had to deal with in order to protect and develop his monasteries. And this poem on Ibrahim ad-Dalal is a fine example of its author's art, making full use of the rhetorical devices customary at the time, in particular antithesis, paradox, and forms of paranomasia. And it starts, أينعى قتيل قد قضى مستشهدا أيبكى شهيد صار للحق مشهدا أيرثى الذي لم يرث يوما لنفسه ولم يخوي عن وعد وغد توغدا. And then it defends Ibrahim from the charge of apostasy, since he was not in his right mind when he committed it. When he came to his senses, he set right what had been crooked. أزال بالسهو العقل وصمة غفلة وثقف غب صحوي ما قد تعود. تعود. And then gradually the references become clearly religious. وعاد بحمد الله عودة سادم رعى العودة ثم العوذ بالله أحمدا. So unlike others, Ibrahim does not fear death or wish for a long life, while he does not shun torture, ta'zib, which is adab, sweet. Whereas before he trembled at the flash of lightning, he spurns fear of death's lightning, the flash of the executioner's sword, when it threatens. وَمَنْ كَانَ لَمْ الْبَرْقِ يُرْعِدُ قَلْبَهُ أَبَى الْخَوْفَ مِنْ بَرْقِ الرَّدَى هِينَ أَرْعَدَى. He offers his neck to the sword, which on the morning of his death gives him a dyed garment, the most splendid cloak he has ever worn. كَسَاهُ خِرَارُ السَّيْفِ ثَوْبًا مُصَبَّغًا غَدَاةَ الرَّدَى أَسْنَى رِدَاءٍ بِهِ ارْتَدَى. And then the mention of the dyed garment introduces reference to the Old Testament patriarchs, first Joseph and Jacob, and then Abraham. Unlike his namesake, however, who offered his son and then sacrificed a ram, Ibrahim sacrificed himself. His blood is the greatest sign, al-ayah al-kubra, shed on the earth in contempt, but given glory in highest heaven. Hi al-ayatul kubra, damun ala thara, muhanan wa fi awj samahi mumajjada. For God has honored Ibrahim's tomb with working miracles, healing the paralyzed, the crippled, and those held captive by illness. And this is, of course, the reason why there was an effort to have him canonized, which I don't think ever came to anything. So Ibrahim is blessed, and he has also brought blessings on his family, his forebears, his community, for he has revived sainthood when its trace had been lost, and through his piety raised again a building which had become a shell. وَأَحْيَيْتَ مِنْ رَسْمِ الْقَدَاسَةِ مَا عَفَى وَشَيَّدْتَ بِالتَّقْوَى بِنَاءً مُمَرَّدًا. And having trod the winepress of death, without denying his faith, he has earned a place at God's right hand in his glory. وَدُسْتَ بِحُبِّ اللَّهِ مَعْصَرَةَ الرَّدَى وَحِيدًا وَلَمْ تُشْرِكْ فَكُنْتَ مُوَحِّدًا لذاك استحقيت الجلوس, and that's how it is, الجلوس بمجده يمينا وسامي سدة المجد مقعدا. And then, like Antoun Bitar before him, the poet asked for Ibrahim's intercession on the Day of Judgment, appealing to him as one who died a martyr to love. And the poem concludes with the date of Ibrahim's death. أَيَا خَيْرَ حِبٍّ مَاتَ بِحُبِّ شَاهِدًا بِالتَّارِيخِ يَا حِبًّا قَضَى مُسْتَشْهِدًا, which adds up right. And I've given quite a lot of quotations from this poem to show how Nicolas Saïk was drawing on the familiar vocabulary and motifs of elite Arabic poetry, echoes of the Quran, and images of the Bible to compose this elegy. Yet the succession of themes, culminating in the designation of Ibrahim as a saint and intercessor, departs radically from the conventional elegy and must make this one of the most original Marathi. Now, as I said, and as you will have understood, the four poems I have discussed are all by Christians. And, of course, the theme of the new martyr is clearly Christian. But there is nothing specifically Christian in Germanus' Farahat, mentioning in the Nasib the same person to whom he addresses his panegyric, nor in Ibrahim al-Hakim's, including the list of books Abdallah Zahir translated and printed in his elegy on him. And I prefer to see all these poems with their original elements as the work of men who were at some distance from the learned circles of mosques and the administrations, although Ibrahim al-Hakim and Antoun Bitar worked sometimes as secretaries, and Nicolas Saïk had contact with ulama and notables. In tracking down Ottoman poems which go against the still widely held view that canonical Ottoman literature was uninspired and repetitive, I think it's useful to look at the productions of these outsiders or newcomers to the literary scene. They may be Christians, but they may also be Muslims, like Ibrahim al-Harisi al-Amili, who praised the Shi'i leader Nasif al-Nassar in epic style. For the study of non-canonical poetry too, more material may have been preserved among the outsiders. And I've only spoken about Syria. What about the rest of the Arab world? How much interesting and unusual poetry remains to be discovered in other parts of it in this period? Now, just to conclude, I would like to turn to the image on the poster which Bilal kindly designed, and which shows paneling from a reception room of an Armenian merchant in Aleppo from the beginning of the 17th century. Some of you will no doubt have seen this actual paneling, which is in the Museum für Islamische Kunst, the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. It's known as the Aleppo Zimmer. And it has a great deal of floral decorations, but it also has on the panels some little miniatures and some inscriptions. The inscriptions are of four kinds. First, there is a wish for happiness in Persian, Shad Bash. The rest of the inscriptions are all in Arabic. We have Arabic proverbs, quotations from the Psalms, and lines from Sufi poetry. And somebody who has worked on these inscriptions once took a group of Syrian musicians who were performing in Berlin round the museum, and when they stopped in the Aleppo Zimmer and the musicians saw the Sufi poetry, they started to sing it. So it's still very much part of the tradition. Now, why I like this illustration is that, in fact, this merchant had something for all his acquaintances, his visitors from Persia, his Jewish, Christian, and Muslim friends or business partners, with texts from their specific tradition and proverbs to appeal to everybody. And this inclusive view of early Ottoman Arabic literary culture is what I've tried to illustrate in this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kilpatrick, for this interesting and very informative lecture, which sheds light actually on an era of Arabic literature which we know very little about and which until recently has been looked down at. I'm particularly happy that you mentioned Az-Zabidi in the beginning of your lecture, because Zabidi is the culmination of the Arabic lexicographical tradition for 10 or 12 centuries, and there he belongs to that era which we have always accused unjustly as being inhitat and so on. I'm sure there are questions from the audience, so the floor is open. Dr. Isa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kilpatrick. I wanted to ask about, I didn't very much get the point of the sects and how they related to one another. So they address, these are the authors that you talked about today were Christian authors, and they were addressing each other and addressing people from the other sects, the elites of the other sects. But you were very careful to distance them from, do I understand you correctly, from the Christian identity, or how does the millet relation, what can you tell us about the way they address each other, and what can we know about the relations between the religious communities then?
Well, for poets at this period, for poets, it's a normal thing to write Marathi about people they consider important. And so Nicolaus Esayich, Nicolaus Esayich and Ibrahim al-Hakim and Antun Bitar were all writing poems about people, Marathi, about somebody they considered deserving of a marthia. I'm not sure that they really thought, well, certainly I don't think that the Ritha of Abdallah Zaghir is really thought of. Well, no, that's not true, because that is in fact directed particularly at the Greek Catholic community, because he was the one he was a great controversist, and he is the poem celebrates the fact that he mentioned these, or that he was considered to have annihilated the arguments of the Orthodox about these concerns. So one could say he is writing this is a Ritha, which is very much celebrating somebody from the community. The same thing is true, of course, of the two poems on Ibrahim ad-Dallal. With Germanus Farhat, I think it's more difficult to say because in any case, Athanasius Dabas didn't belong to his community. I mean, Germanus Farhat thinks of him as a Catholic, but not as a Maronite, of course. But I don't know. I mean, the whole poetic culture was one of addressing people within certain circles, and for these particular poems, those were the circles they turned to. What, as I say, is interesting about Nicolaus Sarikh and also about Ibrahim al-Hakim is that you find them also in other poems addressing people outside their community. There's one of Ibrahim al-Hakim addressed to the Wali of Aleppo on some occasion. And there's another, actually, I mentioned for Dr. Orfali, I wanted to draw his attention to. There's a poem by Ibrahim al-Hakim complaining about Sivas because he was accompanying an Ottoman governor or pasha to Sivas, and apparently I didn't have time to read the whole poem, but apparently one of the problems was that the weather was awful. So I mean, this fits in with your interest about cities. So there are, in some of these diwans, there are poems which are quite generally addressed or addressed specifically to people from other communities. And you can find another way to look at them is then to find out who copied the diwans, which poems, which diwans are widely circulated.
Dr. Abu Hussein.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kilpatrick, for the interesting talk, which rehabilitated the Ottoman period and Arabic literature in the Ottoman period. I have always understood the decadence of Arabic literature and language in the Ottoman period to mean, the linguistic and stylistic quality, the artistic quality, rather than a matter of the themes that occur. In fact, perhaps Christian poets that you have quoted, just like their Muslim contemporaries, who also wrote on a variety of themes and were not necessarily repetitive. I am not literally skilled, so I really, but this, from a layman's point of view, I have always understood this inhitat of the Arabic as pertaining to the quality of the language. I don't know how Dr. Balbaki would have put that, rather than the themes.
Well, that's a controversial point, because it seems as though writers in this period were not so purist about the Arabic language as they later became, because you find, I know much more about prose than poetry, but you find in prose that people will sometimes use a very correct language, and then they will sometimes descend to a more colloquial form, so that, and this was not felt, the argument is used that these people were not capable of writing real proper Fusha, but when you see somebody who writes at the same time Fusha and then a more slightly colloquial, Middle Arabic as we call it, then you say to yourself, well, they were capable, they didn't feel the need to do it. And there's a whole, I think we need to know much more about the way in which people at the time thought about the language, and not what became later on as the sort of considered as the norm that had to be observed. But where poetry is concerned, I confess don't really have enough competence in order to say. I think that, as I say, I think Nicolaus Sarikh, with these images that he uses, this is an extremely interesting poem, and one can see that he really has a great knowledge of classical Arabic poetry. But all these poets are said to have made mistakes sometimes, but then this is one of the common criticisms of a lot of poets, not just in this period.
Yeah, go ahead. On the same theme, if I
Yeah,
تفضل تفضل.
and the mistakes. I mean, that period, even the great sheikhs in Aleppo and Damascus made mistakes. I think it's striking how good it is, the Arabic of this poetry, how well it is. It's as a fusha.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, the new language, one of the big instigators of the language was Germanus Farhat, with Bahs al-Matalib.
It's grammarian. He's
And
Yeah.
the grammar that was a total base for all the people who learned Arabic afterwards.
Well, in the Christian communities, because
But,
but
they
no,
were
but there's-
ahead in this case, you know.
Yeah. But this, for instance, Nicolaus of Sarh is too old to have really profited from.
Yeah,
from
that's true, but his language is not that. Are these diwan's published at all?
well, Germanus Farhat, Nicolaus of Sarh, they are. Antunet Bitar. I mean, we just have these a few quotations by Sheikho. Ibrahim al-Hakim has a diwan which is here in the library as a manuscript, and it would be really interesting, I think, to work on it. It's just very difficult because the ink is eating away the paper. So there are pages where you turn the page and then half the page is sort of, yeah. So they tried to photocopy it or to digitalize it and it wouldn't work. But as I think Professor Dr. Gordon was saying, you could in fact, now that with what they do sometimes with paintings, for instance, is to be able to distinguish the different levels on the paper, and so they could do that. It would be worth it.
We have a wonderful book by Zaidan, his letters.
Ah, yeah.
That you see the ink from both sides, and
Yes.
it's by Nanda.
Well, in pursuit of the same theme raised by Dr. Abu Hussein, I had previously asked you whether there were any stylistic peculiarities in these poems, and you definitely said no. I mean, I would have taken a poem by Germanus Farhat or any of your of the names that you have mentioned, and had you not ascribed it to these people, I would have not guessed that these were Christian writers. I mean, when somebody mentions al-Aya al-Kubra, it reminds me of Surah Taha لنريك من آياتنا الكبرى. I mean, this might well have been a Muslim writing poetry. So there's no basic, as I understand it, and as you confirmed, there's no basic difference between a Christian poet and a Muslim poet from that era. Maybe in the subjects there could be some differences.
Yeah. Because there's, for instance, a great deal of religious poetry. I mean, specifically religious poetry. It would be interesting to also, again, to study that and to see to what extent, although it's on Christian themes, it also makes use of allusions from the Quran. I mean, that would be.
Yes, you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's but there is a great. I mean, I was less interested in that. I was more interested in these rather more secular poems. But there's a great deal of that,
Yeah.
Chris.
Yeah. Further questions or comments?
I have a bibliographical note. Hi, how are you? Perhaps you know about it. There is a dissertation under the supervision of Michael Cook on the Christian martyrs under Islam by somebody called Christian Zahner. I don't know if you've seen it. So it basically talks about the new martyrs and sort of uses the Christian texts of the early Umayyad, of the Abbasid period, on the early Umayyads and Abbasids, to discuss basically, the ways of the new martyrs are, to of course then discuss a little bit more, sort of somehow how the Christian fared under Islam. He's using this literature to try to make some general comments about Christians and Muslims in the early Islamic period.
Yeah. Now, I didn't know about the book. I'd be interested about it.
It's still a dissertation.
Okay, right. It hasn't come. Where was it made?
Princeton.
Yeah. But when I say the new martyrs, actually, it is in certain period, almost it's a sort of technical term. It really means martyrs from the, let's say, the end of the Mamluk period on.
No. New martyrs is basically the martyrs that are not under the Roman Empire. So new martyrs is post-Roman, basically post-pagan, so to speak.
Okay.
And it's also applied to another period of martyrdom, which was the early Mamluk period.
Yeah,
Okay,
anything
right.
which is not
And
Roman.
those have been published as well, and they're basically the martyrs of Antioch, i.e. Syria and Palestine. I can't remember who who edited them. Neo-martyrdom is also applied to that period,
okay,
the
right.
late 13th, early 14th century, as well as the Umayyad period, as well as the early 18th century.
In the sense that the canonized martyrs are the martyrs of the Roman period.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so anything beyond that are the new martyrs. Most of them are not canonized, of course.
But those are prose. Those tend to be prose martyrologies.
Yeah.
I believe. Shuhada and Taqi al-Mansiyun. It's called the Forgotten Martyrs of Antioch.
I know.
For the Mamluk.
Okay, that's And do you know who?
Neo-martyrs.
You know who published that?
I can't remember. I think I have a PDF that I can send you if you like, and it will certainly be here in the library.
Okay. That's a book then.
It's a book, yeah. I think it's 1 or 2 volumes, and it's a collection of saints' lives.
Right.
Some of them from this region, actually, from modern-day Lebanon.
Yeah. That's interesting because in Balkan history, it's associated with the Ottoman period. I suppose because there weren't martyrs before.
Well, you had the Greek ethno-martyrs as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, that's the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's very useful.
Any more questions? Anybody? Well, if not, thank you once more, and we hope that to see this in published form soon, the fruits of your research. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your...
هي of course, in the
well.